Okay, folks, so we are live. So for those listening at home, welcome to the Dungeon Musings YouTube channel. My name is Kevin Madison, and I will be your friendly dungeon muser this evening. Tonight, I want to quickly hop on a Sunday night and record a quick video to... first, for me to mute the darn thing that shouldn't be live. To hop on to celebrate hitting 3,000 subscribers, I had promised a couple of, well, over the last little while, I've had people, to be honest, for the last year, asking about different books that I've used in some of the ongoing campaigns that I've been running, particularly the old school games like AD&D 2nd Edition, Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, and things like that. So I thought what I would do to celebrate 3,000 is to jump on and talk about a couple of the, well, I mean a few, to be honest, of the books that I have really made use of, either some use of or a great deal of use out of in the course of these campaigns. And then what I will try to do as well too is afterwards I will create a list of everything as well, and then if you're able to pick it up through DriveThruRPG or something like that, or from an independent publisher, I'll have those links in there as well too. So I have not done that yet because I just haven't. I didn't think to do that beforehand. But if you see something and you want to make, and you haven't seen the link in the description of the video yet, it will be there at some point. I just don't have it just yet. So. I guess as if you're new to the channel, or if you are a returning vet to the channel, I'll just this is likely to be like many of my overviews, where it's going to go probably pretty long. So if this happens to run in more of a rambly kind of long-winded way, and that's not what you want something that's going to be a 10-minute video. You probably won't enjoy this video, so maybe don't. I wouldn't suffer through my very, very long intro and then the fairly long video that will follow. But if you do want to hear about a whole bunch of cool old school gaming books and some newer stuff that is in the old school spirit, buckle yourselves in, because that's what we're talking about today. So the two campaigns, I guess one other thing I'll say as well is that it's very rare that I make use of a full, the whole thing in a book. So you'll see me over the course of this conversation, I'm going to be referencing some books that I'll reference one or two things I draw from it, and that's really it. The purpose of this is not necessary to say like, oh, here's why this book is a key thing for your campaign. Everyone's table is going to be different. What they require or what they like using to adapt their, the story they have in their head to the experience at the table, and the tools they want to use to achieve that is going to be different for everybody. This is just an opportunity for me to share some of the things that I use and how I use them as well too. I'm going to try and tell you what of the campaigns I use it in and how I kind of think that has worked as well. And yeah, like for some of these things, it's one or two things that I'll draw from, and there's some products that I use everything out of them, so yeah, so let's jump in. And so like I said, the two games that I have been running the longest on the channel, or three games, I guess I'm running right now. One of them is the Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerers of Hyperborea campaign that has been running since January of 2019. That one uses this sucker here, the Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerers of Hyperborea. If you're not familiar with this game, it is a old school clone, but it's an old school Renaissance style game that is based very heavily on Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and it is more so on first, although I see a lot of second in it. It has cleaned up rules, so some things are kind of streamlined in it. In particular, the physical attribute tests are very streamlined. A lot of the attribute bonuses are fairly streamlined. It's got a little bit more of a crunchy tactical combat system, and the setting erases or gets rid of any Tolkien influences. This game is based primarily on Robert E. Howard, what's his name, Clark Ashton Smith, and Lovecraft. However, the rules in this are pretty much on par. So most of the things that you could find with AD&D, so anything you find for AD&D, you can pretty much use in this as well. And then, the other game I've been running, of course, is AD&D 2nd Edition. That's using these. I like my the 89, and then I think it's 93 or 94 for this sucker version. There is, of course, the more recent versions I've got on here. These are the print-on-demand versions you can get through DriveThruRPG. In recent months, we've seen, or I have seen at least, at the time of recording, the prices of players' handbooks, especially the 89 editions, have really gotten pretty crazy. And so, you know, if for myself, this is my preference for using these things. But at the time of recording, what you want to get is just something that's going to have a print copy of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rules in it. This one here that you can get from Drive-Thru RPG, it is based off of the reprints, the second printing version, so there's a different layout in it, but they have the exact same content in them. It's just set out in a different way, and it's got different art in it. And yeah, I mean, if what you want to get, that's a cheaper way, and then another way is getting, of course, for Golden Glory, which has all the rules for the second edition DMG Player's Handbook and DM's Guide. I actually make use of this fairly often because it incorporates the errata that was published over the course of the second edition's lifespan. So if you want to find, you know, a little more information to help guide your judgment on, say, you know, certain spells, you can use this for it. This also incorporates some optional rules that were found in the Complete Fighter's Handbook for different for expanding on weapon proficiencies. And I use that in my campaign, slightly modified version, but I use those pretty much very, very close to rules as written. So if you don't want to dive into the Complete Handbook series, it's a pretty good way of getting just the base rules. And in addition, the PDF for Golden Glory is free, so it costs you nothing to snag a copy of that anyway. In both of my actually AD&D campaigns, I make extensive use of the complete handbooks as well too. I've got those suckers right there on the shelf. I'm not going to refer to them necessarily. I didn't pull them out because once they've been used at character creation, I don't really touch them again. I don't find there is some good, you know, like there's some extra rules on like training your pets and things like that in the Ranger's Handbook, and some other rules for different character or class-specific things, but, you know, the Fighter's Handbook, there's not a huge amount of stuff that I, as the DM, make use of out of those books, because it's either stuff that has been, I think, a lot of the information that's in there is stuff I've synthesized elsewhere, or, you know, there's just not, like the Complete Wizard's Handbook, it's shocking to me how little of the advice for, like, you know, running wizard campaigns and stuff like that I find is particularly useful. So because I find them all very hit or miss, and because it's really only when people are creating characters, I didn't pull those out. But I do make use of them in, you know, in some of my games. Maybe what I'll do is, to organize this a little bit, is I will talk about first official AD&D products and talk about some of the ones that I use quite regularly, and then I'll go into sort of the third-party stuff and talk about how I make use of that stuff. Regular listeners will also know that in keeping with the second edition spirit, I use a lot of house rules in my games. AD&D second edition is one of the most modular role-playing games that I've, at least fantasy, you know, traditional kind of fantasy role-playing games. It is much less of, this is the way you run it, the way that AD&D first edition is, and the way that, say, third 3.5, fourth, fifth edition definitely embraces a lot of house ruling, but not quite to the, probably about the same degree, I think, as what second does. But and anyway, so let's start with those. So one thing that I make a lot of use of, or I have made use of, is Tome of Magic. Tome of Magic is the first kind of, like, you know, magical expansion thing that came out for AD&D. And the reason I like this is because it has the rules for running or playing an elementalist character, and I kind of dig that. Like, I like that as a riff on the traditional wizard. It has rules for wild magic. It's got some explanations for things like quest spells for priests, and it's got a whole host of new spells. And I can't remember if there's magic items in here as well, too. The fact that I can't remember should tell you that I don't make a huge amount of use out of that. This is another one of those ones where I tend to make use of it at character creation, and that's usually it. There are a great number of new spells in here, but there's something else we're going to look at in a little bit that I find is a little better for a resource for extra spells beyond the Player's Handbook. For myself, the way I sort of manage the crazy amount of things that are available, especially for spells, is that I treat the stuff that's in the Player's Handbook as the most common spells, and then Tome of Magic is a little more common, you know, and then I use other resources to expand on that. One of the things that regular viewers will know I make a great deal of use of is my Wilderness Survival Guide manual. This is something that was published right near, closer to the end of the life cycle of first edition. It was part of the expansion of the game into proficiencies. And what this one does is it gives comprehensive rules for making overland travel feel more tactical and more, I don't know, I think to add more texture to it. A less, or a more pejorative way of describing it would be to add more crunch to it. I don't really like, I think because crunch has a connotation to it, I prefer to think of it as texture. And the reason being is because not everyone likes crunch, but texture adds a little bit of, it adds nuance to your game, and it adds things that have an effect on the overall, the overall experience. In particular, keeping track of the hunger and thirst and your encumbrance and the encumbrance of your animals and things like that. All of that stuff may seem fiddly. Like if what your game is about going from town to go to a dungeon and get your thing done there, or just traveling between towns and all the action is happening on, there, or some set piece encounter or a random encounter. You don't necessarily need those. That texture is just adding irritation to the game. But if what you are running is a sandbox game, which is the way I've titled this video, and you want to have something that's going to help reinforce the passage of time and helping the players grind themselves in the problems of those players, I find that this adds a great deal. And it also gives you ways of challenging the players and getting them, giving them problems to resolve beyond just enemies and fighting or role playing. It's the survival element of it. And the cool thing with this book as well is very much like the many of the other rules in first edition, in both editions of AD&D, the chances of survival are, like, at least the skills and things like that, are largely divorced from the levels. So apart from spells, which can have a huge impact on the players on casting, create food and water and things like that, and heroes feast and whatever, this remains an asset you can keep using for many levels. It continually becomes a problem for players if they run out of food, if they run out of water, and they start having to take constitution loss as a result of it. And even when you have those spells, those things become, it makes those things feel even more powerful and even more useful. If the priest is giving up one of their potential healing spells to create water, or, create food and water, that's a big thing, especially if the players have either not, been able to bring food with them, or they've had it destroyed or whatever. Having a pack of goblins come in and, where some of them are distracting the players and the other goblins are making off with their food, like that what this product does is it gives you an opportunity to make those characters, to make that part of the experience very real. Obviously, if what you don't want is to make the travel feel that tactical and whatever, then it's not going to be, it's not an asset that you would want to use. But for me, I love it. I use this in every single old school game that I run for AS for AD&D. The only thing that I'm not quite crazy about from here. Another thing is view distances. Now that's actually been republished in the second edition Player's Handbook. But knowing how far a character can see in moonlit conditions or overcast conditions at night or whatever, in heavy precipitation, that stuff's also really helpful too. It's just a nice thing. You're not going to, keep it in mind all the time, but it's there for you to reference to see, like, oh, cool, because I randomly generated the weather, and you have these fun coincidences or things that come up where, like, let's say the players want to break into an enemy camp and reconnoiter the place or steal some stuff or kill some enemies while they're sleeping. The random generation of weather conditions and things like that help add some either interesting challenges or interesting benefits for the characters to deal with, and the only thing that I don't really use out of here, or not really, I don't use out of here, is the weather system, because the weather system is a bit too simulationist for my taste. I want something that's a little more dynamic and and a little less reliant on sort of actual climate data. So that's the only thing that I find out of here that I really don't get to use. The weights in here are technically out of coins instead of pounds, which are used in 2nd edition and in Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerers of Hyperborea. But if you don't have access to the AD&D books, it's easy to find what the coin weight is. And I think it's like 100 is 1 pound. So it's, even if you're using it for 2nd edition or for another game, there's definitely stuff out of here that I really like. There's also, I guess the other thing is it lets a lot of those skills that, like wilderness characters will take things like hunting or herbalism or things like that. And maybe it's just the way I run games, but like in other games, it so rarely comes up as a useful thing. Whereas in this, hunting becomes like, there's a reason why you would want to do that. And the nice thing that this game does that I don't like in modern games is it doesn't, and in fairness, it's because the modern games are trying to go for a different style of play. They're not trying to simulate this sort of, day-by-day fight for survival kind of stuff. What I don't like in modern games like Pathfinder 1 or D&D 5th is that survival at one point just gets reduced to just a dice roll. And once you make that roll, then your character's fine. You don't need water, you don't need food, you don't need to hunt. What this does is it allows those characters who have those proficiencies to feel badass, but it still, it doesn't make them superhuman. It makes them more optimal at doing those things. At like, if they find herbs, they're going to find more of them. If they're hunting, if they're able to come across animals and things like that, they're going to be able to down more. So it doesn't become that thing that I don't like, where I've got a shit ton of points in my skill ranks in my survival roll, so I'm going to find a spring in Mordor kind of thing, and it doesn't require me as the DM to intervene and go, well, no, that's kind of ridiculous. So there's not the overt hand of the DM coming in and being, no, your cool thing that you could use that the rules say you can use, you can't use that here right now. This gets around that by just making it, not making them basically like a Urban Outfitters, not Urban Outfitters, a survival, place. So I really, really like that. I make a huge amount of use out of that. For all of my games, I also make use of the Monster Manual 2. Now, the reason for this one, partly, I love this book in general. There's a ton of, this was my favorite monster book as a kid, and there's a ton of great monsters that I like using out of here, including the Wemmick and Orim Vorax is in here, the Behir is in here, but the real reason I continue to make use of this, even though I run 2nd edition, is it has, I think, the most comprehensive list in AD&D for monsters by terrain. And obviously, like, as the game advanced, there were new things that were added to it, and there's other games that have different things in them, like Ash has different monsters in them than what AD&D does. But this gives me a huge list of monsters as a starting point for me to start adding monsters in. And for running 2nd edition, anything that's listed in here is probably going to be in my Monstrous Compendium. And if it's not, it's in one of the Monstrous Compendium annuals, and we'll talk about those in a bit. So that's something, not only, and the stats out of here, I use them in Ash as written, I use them in AD&D 2nd. And one of the things that has remained consistent between those games, AD&D and Ash, is the treasure types. So you don't even need to worry if you're going to be playing your game running or rolling random treasure. You can use the treasure types as listed in here. They track completely well, perfectly up with the treasure types in Ash and the treasure types in AD&D 2nd. Let's see here. What other things? Oh, for 2nd edition, now this is another one of the ones where I pick and choose out of here. This is the Combat and Tactics book that came out with the skills. What's going on with my camera here? Hello. There we go. The Combat and Tactics book, it was part of sort of the last iteration of AD&D before 3rd edition came out. This was one of 4 books that came out that really kind of allowed you to design your own. It's the step towards what would be 3rd. Reading this in retrospect now, it reminds me very much of what combat is like in 3rd edition, which is that on a tabletop with a map and miniatures. It's grid oriented. It is attacks of opportunity, and a lot of the stuff we see in 3rd edition and then those games going forward is first expressed in here. There's a lot of ideas that were still, like bull rushes and attacks of opportunity, which weren't necessarily called that. That's been part of AD&D since at least 2nd, and I think since 1st as well too. It's just that it wasn't called a specific thing, and like a lot of other stuff in AD&D 2nd, it's in one paragraph in one part of the combat section and then never repeated again. So it's a lot of people, when they were growing up, if you weren't carefully reading every single paragraph, you might miss some stuff. This gives some good stuff like the disarm rules in here I pretty much use as written. There's tons of great gear that has been added as well. They revise crossbow damage in here to be much higher, so it goes from the 1d4 or 1d6 it is in the player's handbook up to 1d10 for a heavy crossbow in here. And with having to take a round to reload the things, that makes it a little better and something you might want to use. It's a grab bag of optional rules. It's great rules for, grenade-like weapons. So the step towards like alchemist fire and whatnot is all in here. And a huge amount of weapons are all consolidated in here as well, too. There are other books that came out that added some new weaponry. The Oriental Adventures book added a shit ton of new weapons. Unearthed Arcana in AD&D added a bunch of new weapons. But this really, continues that trend and adds a whole bunch of new stuff in there too. And what I like about this one as well too is it begins to sort of transition away from the idea that every attack has to target armor class. One of the things that I have found to be a problem is once characters get to have a certain armor class, they effectively become immune to anything other than indirect magic attacks. And the thing I like about this is there's a lot of stuff, like a lot of AD&D products, there are, exception rules that pop up for different things. Like nets basically use what would be understood in Pathfinder as a touch armor class, an armor class that doesn't count your armor and that does count your dex bonus. So some of those ideas are first expressed in here, and I like using those because, if you want to be able to challenge your players with very low, or player characters with very, very low armor class, there's sort of a fun thrill in like the fact that they're only hit on a 20, for some things, especially for low level creatures. So you're rolling shit, you're able to throw tons and tons of those things at the players. But what's kind of fun sometimes is having ways of getting around that, and ways that still remain threats for the players. So the disarm rules don't make use of the player character's armor class. It's independent of that. It instead functions more on their THAC0, on their combat ability. The net likewise is more on their agility rather than their armor. And there's another product I'll talk about in a little bit that also gives another way of having physical combat and physical confrontation without relying on just the armor class. So it gives more nuance and more variety to the combat. It also is I find it to be a really great reference. So if the players decide they want to try something, it's a great resource to go to figure out how to house rule, because there's a lot of consistency through it. For me, I had heard a lot from a lot of people on my AD&D 2nd video or overview that a lot of people love this and a lot of people use this. And when I was younger, I knew a lot of people who use this thing too. For me, having gone through 3rd edition, 3.5, Pathfinder and whatnot, I find that this is a little too close to that, and I want a little more light on its feet combat system. But there's more than enough stuff out of here that I do make regular use of, that I find this a pretty indispensable book. I don't reference it, like I said, all the time, but I certainly go to it fairly often. Let's talk about... this is more of a character thing. I mentioned that I'm not going to talk about the player's handbooks because I don't really, I don't make use of those. But there are 3 things that I do that are player-focused, primarily, and those are the 3 books that came out from Forgotten Realms that are on different gods and pantheons. So the first was Faiths and Avatars, and then that had a companion book called Demi-Human Deities, and then there was a third book put out called Powers and Pantheons. And what these books are, they're basically all the same. All what they do is they expand on all the gods that are present in the Forgotten Realms setting. And Forgotten Realms is a huge amount of gods in it. It's a very, very diverse setting. Regular viewers will know that Forgotten Realms is not really my go-to thing. It's never really been my favorite setting. It's not something that really speaks to me. But what this does, because of it's such a broad such a broad setting, what this does is it gives you tons of rules on the gods themselves, which is, I mean, I'm never going to use the stats of a god in a game, probably, so it's neat having that stuff, but I like the discussion of their manifestations, even just, if not to use the stuff as written, to steal ideas for my own gods, and they have rules for the specialty priests. One of the things that this line of books did, and there's some other products that added some of the stuff to it as well, is it made the priests who follow certain gods a separate class. So in addition to the regular classes you've got, it's a whole separate thing. And what it does is it allows the priest to really become this enormously flexible and varied character class. And even if you're not running your campaign in the Forgotten Realms, these books are pretty darn long, so there's lots of great ideas you can steal, and tons and tons of gods in each of which has its own specialty priest. And a lot of the specialty priests have some specialty either powers or spells they have access to. And I found over the course of like the last 8 months coming up of play in our Night Below campaign, it really allows the various priests to feel enormously unique. So it's something that I would definitely use regardless of whatever. If I was running a campaign where there were a variety of different gods, I'm for sure going to use the stuff out of here to try and figure out, what those gods' individual priests would look like, just to give players more options, and also for NPCs. The other thing is, if you do happen to be running a game in the Forgotten Realms, like my ongoing Legacy the Crystal Shard game does, this gives you a ton of really great ideas for how to incorporate the gods in a less than obvious way. If you want to play up the manifestations, of your god, or what colors they would have in a dream or something like that, it's a great resource to go to. It's also, if you want to visualize what the different priests would be like, what they would value, what kind of special abilities they'd have, it's cool in that way too. And I've used that in our game for we've had priests of Dumathoin, the digger underneath the earth for the dwarves, for Baranar's True Silver, for Clangadin Silverbeard, for what else? Solinar, the archer, one of the elven gods of archery. So it's a great, I find it's enormously useful, and it's a book that I would use not only for players, but also for NPCs and for campaign ideas, for whatever campaign I'm running. So that's cool. Other things, let's talk about other ways of making players' lives hell. There are a series of books that came out for the Ravenloft setting, for the Gothic horror setting. I was a big fan of them back in the day anyway, but one of the things that came out for them are these Van Richten's guides. And what these are is books that are specifically designed for, as a kind of in-universe pieces of, in-universe artifacts mixed with campaign ideas and rules ideas, for things like vampires, we got ghosts, and weird beasts, and vampires, and the Lich, and Risen Undead. Like, there's a ton of these things, all of which are available on Drive-Thru RPG. And the thing I really like about them is there's a ton of great ideas that they offer for changing those monsters up. One of the things that I enjoy with AD&D is not only because of the wealth of characters that are in there. I love tweaking monsters. I love having characters not know what to expect. The regular viewers will know that I often try and describe monsters what they look like rather than by their names. And this is a nice way to mechanically differentiate your things. So, we've had in one of our the sort of wrap-ups, or the close, wrap-ups for one of the arcs on our Night Below campaign, the characters faced an elven ghost. And I didn't want to just do a normal ghost that aged characters, partly because it didn't really feel like that was a lot of fun, and it would hurt some characters more than others. The humans and whatnot would certainly feel that a lot worse than what the elves would. So instead, I took some rules out of there and took some ideas, and I stole time. Like I stole memory. What it would do is it would drain memory. So each time the character was damaged, take a little or hit, he would take a little bit of damage, but in addition would lose part of their memory. So they'd be suddenly like, "How the hell did I get here?" Kind of thing, and they'd lose a week or a day or whatever. And that was an idea I found in there. There's some really good ideas for changing up things like if you don't like energy drain in an old school game. And I know a lot of people like playing, with that kind of hardcore mode in there, but as far back as AD&D, they were giving options for getting around that or for replacing level drain with other things. And we're going to talk about one of those products in a second here. And this is one of the ways that you can do that. And a lot of them are really interesting, very flavorful kind of results. And again, like the thing that for those players who have, seen it all and killed it all, it's a really great way of shaking up those expectations and keeping the unknown as a very present thing at the table. So I love those books for it. And they're a shit ton of fun to read, too. There's great, the idea of Van Richten, the monster hunter, writing these things is pretty fun. Speaking of Ravenloft, one of the things that I also make use of is some of the adventures. And I don't necessarily use AD&D adventures in my games, partly because these games were written in a different time. Sometimes I like using some of the old school products, but I often feel that their maps feel they're not the tone that I want to go for. They don't feel like credible locations in a lot of cases. And some of the ones that are, some of the late 80s, early 90s products, they have terrific maps in them, but the adventures themselves are a little too railroady. But what is helpful for them, so I've got 3 ones as examples here. I've got Feast of Goblins, the first adventure that was released for Ravenloft, which is a really beautiful product. I've got Slavers, which came out in the mid-90s, like right near the end of the life cycle. And this one feels very much like like what a 3rd edition adventure would feel like. And Against the Giants, the 25th anniversary edition, which was a rewrite of the classic quartet of giant adventures. The reason I really like those, not even necessarily for the content or for the adventures themselves, although I think Slavers and Against the Giants are pretty great. What I really love about using these for is to get ideas of what set treasure is going to be like. Because in the course of a campaign, I'm going to have random treasure in a lot of different places. If they're plumbing tombs or they're defeating monsters and taking their loot, I'm probably going to randomly generate the treasure using the treasure tables and things like that. But if I've got a situation where, like recently, I had to come up with rewards for players at the end of our Legacy of the Crystal Shard, the most recent sort of arc. And it was today, actually, is when the characters got it. And I wasn't quite sure how to judge how much I should be awarding for this, like how much is too much. And I didn't want to make it too on point, so it was, like a character happens to be specialized in, a halberd. And, oh, look at that, you found a magic halberd. Like, I wanted to find a different way of doing that. So what I did is I took, because they're around the same level as the recommended levels for Feast of Goblins, I just went through the last, half of the module, made note of all the things that were found there, and then just found equivalents or rough equivalents in terms of the XP cost for what those different magic items would be. And that gave me, I'm assuming that the designers of a lot of these things, in particular the late life cycle stuff, the Against the Giants and Slavers, by that point the players or the designers had a pretty good idea of exactly what a balanced encounter would look like. So I can look at those and get a good idea of, oh, here's what an average reward should be. I also love using them, especially those late life cycle ones, for ideas for what is a reasonable challenge. Like what they had in their encounters, because encounters in AD&D are very different from those in more modern games. You're not having a balanced encounter. You're setting up, scenarios, and then the players are going to interface with that scenario in different ways. So, for instance, like figuring out how to populate my Knoll camp, I used the Slavers book as a way of sort of getting a sense of, okay, here's how they did it in here. Now I can try and tweak it to fit what I need for my campaign. So I find them to be, even if you're never going to run them, and some of them are quite good as well, and probably could be run as written. Well, not probably. All of them could be. It's just for myself, I probably lean closer to more modern sensibilities for modules, or really, to be honest, I prefer making kind of things up on the fly, and I want to take stuff piecemeal. You still could totally run those things. They're great. The rules work terrific. So those things. Another thing I make a great deal of use out of is Ruins of Undermountain. Now, this is the original box set for Ruins of Undermountain. There was a second one that came out for it as well. It's basically like a couple booklets with a shit ton of maps for massive dungeons. I probably never would use it for that. But what I do like about this is there's some really, really good rules for traps. And you would think that, like, having traps, like, since traps are such a kind of classic part of D&D, you would think that there would be easily identifiable rules for constructing your own traps and figuring out what they should be and how players can interface with them beyond just the find, remove, trap skill of the thief. But it's really hard to find that stuff. Like, at least in the AD&D second stuff, there's not a huge amount of insight into how to construct those things, at least outside of this. This has some amazing rules for setting up a wide variety of different kinds of traps in there, magical and otherwise. So I love this for that. And some of the traps in here are deadly. Like, there's a choking trap that I stole out of here that I've used for some goblins in one of the Night Below things, and the players hated them. But what they learned to do, though, is to really, those characters who were capable of looking for traps and things like that, or making them think about the surroundings and testing the ground and testing the walls and stuff like that, it had the desired effect. Like, the desired effect of the trap is not necessarily for the trap to go off, it's the anticipation of the trap going off. And the trap going off is what builds that anticipation. Seeing the consequence of it once or twice. And that's what I love about that product. It's got tons of great ideas. And many of them are dependent on the character attributes as opposed to level-based things. So again, there's a lot of continued use that I would make out of that as player characters go up in levels. They don't level out of that stuff, as it were. Next up is Pages from the Mages. This is a more recent book that I picked up, but what it's got is a bunch of sample spell books in it. And again, like, it's one of those things that you may not think of as like, well, how hard is it to throw together a spell book with some stuff in it? But one of the things that is really important for the player characters, if you want to allow the players who are arcane spellcasters to continue to learn new spells, they need to be finding those things, either on adversaries or whatever. That's obviously fairly, it's fairly common sense stuff, but putting together those spell books and giving them interesting, kind of appearances and things like that, it's something I like doing. Like, I want it to feel like there's a history or an implied history behind that artifact. And this gives some terrific ideas for samples and ideas for creating your own. So I really, really love it. It says Forgotten Realms on it, but like, it's nothing stops you from using this from any other setting that you want. Another recent addition to the collection is Lords of Darkness by Ed Greenwood. And what this is basically, it's a late life cycle AD&D first edition book that is all about undead. And it gives you, basically for all the kind of classic undead that you have in AD&D, like ghouls and ghasts and liches and mummies and zombies and shadows and not shadows. Shadows aren't shadows undead. I can't remember. Specters, wraiths. It gives an encounter for each of those and a bunch of optional rules for how to tweak them and how to make effective use out of them. It's got some of the best advice on modifying energy drain. I mentioned earlier in this episode or in this video that there was an older product that began thinking about different ways of implementing the idea of energy drain. The threat of losing those levels. And again, so energy drain is one of those things that is very, very, no one likes having it happen to them, but I think it's very much like traps, where it's the threat of it that becomes the thing that makes undead creatures, it's because so many of them have level drain, feel so different from other creatures. And it also gives, most times, clerics the opportunity to really shine because of turn undead. Now, the specialty priests, the thing to be cautious about is that not all of them can turn undead. They get special powers and shit like that, but if you take that ability away from them, undead become even more scary, especially where energy drain is involved. But this is a fantastic product, like, just for giving ideas for tweaking. If you're prone to using undead, like I love me some undead. I never had this back in the day. I didn't even know about it until I clicked through on Drive Through RPG. They had a blurb about it, and I was like, how have I not heard about this amazing book? It's fairly short and whatnot, but I love it. Great art in it too, from, I think, Ken Lashy does most of the art inside. Another thing I use in all of my old school games is all the expansions for the Monstrous Compendium. So these are a bunch of ones from, some from Planescape, whoop, some from Ravenloft, whoop, and then the annual compendiums that came out. There were 4 of them that came out after the Monstrous Compendium came out, the second edition version of the bound one. Now, the original, regular viewers will know, or at least people who are familiar with second edition will remember that the way that they released the monsters originally was through a series of things called Monstrous Compendium? No. Monstrous Manual, I think. I can't remember what it was called, but it was these paper, basically it was loose paper that was put into a binder, and you would get new loose paper, and then sometimes they would release a new binder. They released, I think, 2 binders, and then everything was these loose pages, and you were supposed to put those loose pages into your binders, and that's how you kept track of them. I've heard, since I recorded the second edition video, that there were some people that were a fan of them. I could not stand them. They were terrible. I would lose pages, I'd see pages bent, and I hated them. But these are fantastic. Having them bound together as books, I love them. And it also adds a lot of monsters. And I always like having new monsters, not only just for, having some stuff that's off the beaten path for players, but also for, it's fun to think a lot of, sometimes, an adventure or an encounter or a set piece or whatever will come from reading a certain monster and being like, oh, that's really neat. I didn't even think about that being a potential, use, a thing that would be generating a story around it. So that's something that you can do with it as well. And the neat thing with these, especially the annuals as well, I had stopped when I was a kid. I stopped playing AD&D in the early 90s, so I missed a lot of the later life cycle stuff. I'd moved on to different games at that time. So it was a real pleasant surprise for me when I was looking through some of the latest or the last of the Monsters Compendium annuals, and I was seeing monsters that I thought were introduced in 3rd edition. So there's things like the Spellweaver, and there's things like the, what's it called? Not the Ettercap, but there's another, the Tain. There's a bunch of these monsters that were actually introduced in AD&D 2nd that have become part of the, the lexicon or the bestiary, I guess, bestiary of the monsters that are thought of as signature monsters, which is kind of cool. And the thing I like about that is that with using these things, it gives me AD&D versions of monsters that I would find in, say, a Pathfinder adventure or something like that. So I don't need to come up with the stats for them. I already have the stats for AD&D ready to go in some of these later releases. Or if you're planning on using AD&D 3rd stuff and reskinning it, you can find those monsters in there. So, and those monsters can be used in ASH or in AD&D 2nd or whatever. So I find them to be enormously useful in either of those campaigns, and I have made use of them in both as well. I've also got, oh boy, if you are wanting to set things in Greyhawk, so Greyhawk is the original setting from Garrett Gygax. 2nd edition has a From the Ashes box set that I used to sort of set up the campaign. It's the 2nd box set that was released for the Greyhawk setting. The original Greyhawk box set was this gold thing with a beautiful map in it with 2 different booklets. From the Ashes follows that on pretty much the same, but is a little later in the time period. But what I find that I use most for my ongoing Greyhawk campaign, which is where we set our Night Below thing, is this thing, the Greyhawk Player's Guide. This has basically all the best information that you need in kind of a bite-sized chunks about that make, I guess, the Greyhawk setting special. That includes the calendar, the gods, there's not full rules, mind you. You know, it's not the replacement for those other things. But what it gives you is in one place you can look and find the languages or the holidays or the different different kind of currencies, suggestions and recommendations for kits, you know, and the runes and glyphs, which have appeared, I think, in Greyhawk since the original thing too. So it's great. And then again, if you're want to keep track of time in your campaign and you like the random elements that show up, like visibility and things like that, there is a Phases of the Moon part of the calendar in here that I adore because it often has these funny things that coincidentally become consequential in our game. So like, our heroes recently went to go and sneak into a knoll encampment, and it just so happened that it was a clear sky night, and they also found that when I looked, it was almost there was almost no moon left in the sky, so there was very little light, so that it was like an optimal situation for them to try and infiltrate this camp, and it just randomly came together because of making use of that product. So I mean, that's a very probably silly little thing, but it was something that gave me a great deal of joy. So I really, really love that product for a quick reference thing to get all my Greyhawk stuff. You can find most of it online, probably at one of the wikis. But now let's talk about some last couple of second edition things before we go on to more modern editions of D&D. One is the Encyclopedia Magica. These are a collection of all the magic items that were published for D&D from 1975 until 1999. And it has, some of these are really useless, like they're kind of very, very, very situational, like a spade that will dig slightly faster than what you using a normal spade would be. So, not all of these things are gems, but there's more than enough great stuff out of here for you to use in your campaigns. And in particular, a lot of modern games often lean quite heavily on stuff, more so the 3rd edition 3.5 Pathfinder stuff. But the stuff that the stuff that is the best stuff you find is often the stuff that modifies stats. It's your save bonuses, it's your weapons, it's your armor and whatever. And like, that still remains a thing in AD&D and in 2nd, but what I really love about this is it expands the amount of trivial kind of magic items or fairly situational magic items that, beyond just the +1 sword, +1 shield or whatever. So you can have an enormous amount of really unique magic items that you introduce into your campaign. Some of it, randomly, like we randomly generated at one point in our Night Below campaign, this war paint that they found war paint on a fallen, a fallen Aarakocra. And what I decided to interpret it was as I think it was pigment of something or other, and I interpreted it as war paint. But what the thing did is it transformed the user into a 7th level ranger, complete with a +3 bow for X amount of time. And with the way we interpreted that, I was like, all right, well, it's creating, or transforming you into the ancestor hero of the tribe. And like, what a cool thing. And that ended up playing a pretty big role in a recent session as well, too, as one of the Aarakocras made use of it. But it's just one of those random magic items that it is very situational, like they'd only get the one use out of the thing, but it added a lot to the story and also made that character feel pretty unique. And there's been other things we've found over the course of the campaign where characters, both these two campaigns and the one for the AD&D campaigns and the ASH campaign, where some of the things we found in here have been just great. And even reading it too, like it's a lot of fun to read it just to think of like what things I could be introducing into the campaign. And some things can be, I mean, all of it can be very easily reskinned, and they give really good comprehensive rules for how each thing is used. You know, if timing is a big thing in your game, it's not for every old school game, and it's not for every AD&D campaign, but in my game we use weapon speeds and casting times and things like that. So knowing where in the sequence you are for like drawing a potion and yopping the thing and how long it is before it takes effect, all that stuff is handily in one place with the Encyclopedia Magica. I adore these. These were actually a birthday present from my folks a couple of years back, and I love these books. In that same vein, there are 2 sets of compendiums that were released around the same time. The Priest's Spell Compendium, which is 3 books, and the Wizard's Spell Compendium, which is 4 books. And these provide, same thing, it's all the spells released for the different classes over the course of the game's lifespan from 1975 to the publication, which I 99 or 98, I don't know, 99 and 97. 97 for the Wizard's Spell Compendium, 99 for the Priest's Spell Compendium. They also give, I guess the other thing that the Encyclopedia Magica does really well that I like is it retroactively applies GP cost and XP, or XP reward GP cost for all those things as well. So it gives you a one-stop shop for figuring out, for crafting items and things like that. The spell books are fantastic because it gives you tons of oddball spells that you can introduce into your game. You know, if you've got cleric, or you've got casters who lean into a specific direction, like say an elementalist, or what's a rare thing? Diviner. Yeah, diviner. And there's definitely some signature spells that come from that. But what these do is they expand out what those options are. In the same way that specialty priests add an enormous amount of variety to the priests, same thing with the Priest Spell Compendium and the Wizards one. It's just a neat way of surprising players. You know, if they get one of my favorite spell introductions we've had in our Night Below campaign was a spell called Shark Bolt, which creates 2 watery sharks that seek out a target and then grab the target. And I love that. Partly because I love sharks, but it's also a neat thing, and it is a neat way of adding a very unique spell so that player character can have a really unusual thing. It's not just magic missile, it's not just fireball or whatever. It's a completely unique thing that they can have. And if you don't want to introduce them as spell books, you can certainly you just use them for scrolls. Put them on a scroll, let the characters use them. If they never use them again, that's fine, but if they've got them there's no faster way, especially for priests, there's no faster way to communicate to priest characters how important certain spells are than by giving them scrolls and watching them use it and go, oh shit, that's really good. I should make sure I memorize that next time. And again, it's also a way to, what is going on with my camera tonight? It's also a way to add some pretty fun variety into the different gods, because in AD&D there's different spheres, that the different gods have access to at different levels, and same thing with wizards. There's different schools of wizards, and both of the books give you a full breakdown of those things as well too. So it's a great one-stop shop for looking up spells and spell rules and things like that, and also to add some oddball stuff into your campaign. Now let's talk about a little more modern stuff. So one of the books that I have by my side when I'm running any fantasy game nowadays is Xanthar's Guide to Everything. Now this is a product for AD&D 5th edition, and I don't really run 5th edition that often. I'm going to be running it sometime soon for our Heroes Save Villages campaign, but a lot of the material that's in here is very it's focused on 5th edition. So like the mechanical stuff, not great out of here, but what is useful, the naming charts out of here are fantastic, even for just like stealing ideas. So I love that. You can use online naming creators as well too, but this I tend to be someone who prefers to flip through a book than to look online, so I love that aspect. And the downtime rules in here, even though I don't use them, because I find that I try, especially for the old school games, I try to not gamify things, too much. I don't want to have a mini game that's downtime and a mini game that's gambling, and a mini game that's something else, like mini game that's travel. Like I like that stuff for certain games. I like that stuff in Powered by the Apocalypse games or more narrativist kind of games. But for my old school games, no, I want it to be, I want it to have that. Either just have it just all be fiction where we're just describing what's happening, or use some simulationist rules to track the day by day. But what it does give is some really good ideas for what you could be doing with it. This is one of those ones, like I said, that I don't use everything out of it, and to be honest, I don't use most of the things out of it, but the things that I do use out of it, I use a lot. Another 5th edition product that I really love is the Comprehensive Equipment Manual. Now, this version of it, I just noticed today when I was trying to recommend it to someone else had asked about it. You can't get this version anymore. They have a new version of it that's been updated, but it's not available as print on demand anymore. I got this from the DM's Guild. Now, this is also for 5th edition. At the time of recording, what the creator of this thing said is that they are trying to get it approved, so it should be available sometime soon. And when it does, I might pick up a new version of it, because looks like there's some neat new stuff they've added, including some new art. But the thing I absolutely, if you don't mind using PDFs, you can get a PDF copy of this. The things I particularly love about this are, for my games, there are some fantastic random tables for adding character to your magic items. And if you want, adding small abilities as well. So, for instance, you can make a random roll. There's a list of 100 potential creators of that magic item. Not all of those results will be appropriate for every campaign or every campaign setting, but it's easy to reskin them on the fly. What is the intent for the item, which is awesome. You can randomly generate a detail of history for it as well. And you can also generate a minor property and a minor flaw if you want. I don't tend to add the flaws in on mine, because I find them to be that's a bit of a pain in the ass if every magic item has some, some drawback to it. But what I do use it for is I'll sometimes use it for what race or whatever culture, I guess, created it, because that's sometimes fun. But more what I use it for is historical events and minor property. And we generally roll them on the fly. Like, it's part of our game to be like, okay, let's discover what this stuff is. And then we try and, for myself, it gives me an opportunity to think on the fly and trying to reconcile what this is about. And it's always provided some really, really fun backstory for it. Some really great stuff. Oh, there's another product I was thinking of, from an earlier edition. So, here. These 3 things. It's for 3rd edition, or 3.5, Races of Destiny, Races of the Wild, and Races of Stone. What these were supplements for 3rd edition that added, each of them added a new race, some of which have, the Goliath has carried on into 5th edition even. And the other 2 I don't think did. The Illumian, I think, went away. But anyway, the Goliath certainly came from there. But the thing that's great about these is there are breakdowns for Elvish and Dwarvish languages in here, complete with language components. And the thing I like about that is I use those to name things. In my Night Below campaign, all the magic items and things like that all have Elven names or Dwarven names or whatever, and I would use it for other species. I know the Dragonomicon released for that edition, which, where is it here? Where are you, my friend? It's a beautiful book, the 3rd edition Dragonomicon. It has language, draconic language stuff in it. And I use that for creating dragon names in it as well, too. And obviously, like, I could probably do it on my own if I wanted and whatnot, but I like the fun of putting it together and having that as a consistent part. So if I do need to go back and name something else, I'll know, when I use song in an elven name, it'll have the same whatever fictitious, noise is in the book. So I like those for that as well. Moving on to more modern games as well. It may surprise some to learn that I use quite a bit of stuff from Pathfinder. Not for the rules necessarily, but often as a source of inspiration or for some of the non-mechanical stuff that they have in there. For one, I use the Pathfinder Adventure Paths. This is one of the pocket editions that they released of the Rise of the Rune Lords one, which consolidates all 6 modules into one book. I love I don't love running module, the adventure paths, because it's just not the way I like to run my fantasy RPGs. But the maps, the ideas, the NPCs, the situations that are set up in many of these are very, very easily adapted into classic old school games. They also have lots of good ideas often because Pathfinder is a different animal, and they often build they'll build monsters with character classes and things like that in there. You don't need to do that for when you're converting over, but it gives you some neat ideas for things like, I know in one of the opening scenes in here, there's a goblin bard that's, howling away in the background and giving a boost to the other characters. And I like that. I don't want to embrace the full level of crunch that you get, or I'm using the pejorative term now, the full level of texture or complexity with the Pathfinder rules. But I like that. I like the idea of using that to add some variety to my tactical encounters. So there's tons of great ideas, and in fact, in our Night Below campaign, canny viewers may have noticed that the Heathertop Warren map is actually a reskinned version of Thistletop from this particular adventure. And I even, so this is the map of Thistletop. I redrew it and changed some stuff about it because mine wasn't off the coast and there were some other issues. But it gave me a great starting point for, for setting up this set piece sort of dungeon or stronghold for the players. And so many of the adventure paths have equally great stuff. I've used... there's a map of a place called Ironfang Keep out of the I can't remember what the adventure path is called, but it's one of the Ironfang Legion, maybe is what it's called. But anyway, it's this map out of one of the more recent, from the last couple of years, adventure paths, and it's become the home base for our characters in our Ash game. So tons of great ideas you can steal from these things, even if you don't use the mechanics in it. Similarly, the Ultimate Equipment Guide can be a great resource for figuring out equipment that isn't in other things. So if I want to introduce, say, Elemental or Alchemist's Ice, or, Alchemist's Acid, or things like that, or any of the other crazy different, the gear that's out of here, not necessarily the magic items. This is Ultimate Equipment, by the by. This has a ton of great things that I can convert over in terms of costs, and I'll often look at something, say like a sword or a piece of chainmail armor. I'll find out what the cost is in AD&D, figure out what the cost difference is between this and the core rulebook, and then I'll use that as a way of figuring out what the cost of other things are. You need to use your, your judgment for it, but, even like the different kinds of materials that you can use to craft armor out of here. It's a great idea. Great things you can steal very easily for your AD&D campaign. And the idea of Mastercraft weapons that permeate first or third edition D&D 3.5 and Pathfinder, I've adopted that for AD&D second because it's a fun way of giving, without having to give players magic items, because magic items should be really, once you're able to affect monsters that can only be affected by magic, that becomes a big thing. And what the Masterwork rules give me is a way of giving characters rewards without giving them just magic items, right? So that's a cool idea I like quite a bit. The Ultimate Wilderness book. All these ones are going to be the pocket editions. You can get these in the pocket edition or the big ones. And you can also find all of these rules online for free at the Archives of Nethys, I think it's called. So you can find all these things for free as well, too, which is great. Ultimate Wilderness is probably one of the worst received books for Pathfinder, as far as I understand it, but I adore it. I think it's got some really good ideas for making wilderness adventures a little more, an event. And it definitely, the rules in here for searching hexes and for populating random encounters and things like that, it is definitely more on a gamist kind of bent than what I would normally be comfortable with, but the ideas are pretty good, and Pathfinder is a fairly simulationist game as well, in the same way that AD&D 2nd is, or AS is. So some great ideas out of here. I love the weather charts out of here. They are much easier to work, but still give that feel of a dynamic weather system. Complete with extreme weather as well. There's some good discussion of things like, hazards and more magical things. The Wilderness Survival Guide tends to be a little more real-worldy and doesn't necessarily focus on sort of some of the magical shit that you would see in more modern games on a regular basis. So there's some ideas for that in here. There's ideas for, collecting or harvesting stuff from animals, like trophies and things like that, or things to craft other things. So good ideas in here, and even the mechanical stuff. AD&D is not so far removed from Pathfinder that it's impossible to convert stuff over. So tons of great ideas you can steal from this to put in your other games too. Even if you're just stealing the descriptions of the various poisons and unguents and things like that. Tons of great stuff. Ultimate Intrigue has some really good rules in it for setting up heists and for managing influence with organizations. This proved to be a great resource for me setting up my reputation rules that I use in my Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerers of Hyperborea game. I don't use them in either the other two games that I currently run, but I did make use of these in our Barrow Maze game. Now that game was with Pathfinder 2nd and some other games, so it wasn't really an old school game. But if I wanted to have a game that focused around politics and things like that, I'd absolutely use the rules out of here as a starting point for ideas for how to use that. And again, like a lot of other stuff in Pathfinder, it's definitely written for the Pathfinder system. It is very easy to reskin this stuff and figure out what the math should look like for for your old school games. This is one where there's maybe 8% of the book that is really particularly useful for it, but even if you don't like the book, you still can get the rules for Intrigue online for free. Another source of great ideas is the Pathfinder Game Mastery Guide. Now, it's interesting, the change in philosophy between first edition of Pathfinder and second edition, because the second edition Pathfinder book is really, the Game Master Guide is really a shit ton of optional rules to tweak the base rules to make it fit in your campaign. Lots of different things. This isn't that. There is some stuff like that's like that in here, but this is more along the lines of what you'd expect in a DM's guide, which is to say there's tons of random encounters, there's lists of adding quirks to magic items, quirks for NPCs, random encounters in a town, in a back alley, in a whatever, names of ships, names of captains, and rules for gambling, which are very easily converted, changeable to or convertible for AD&D 2nd or for AS. Random plot ideas and things like that. Like, it's stuff that appears in a lot of other DMGs as well too, but I just particularly like the stuff that's out of here. I think it's really got some great ideas in here, great tables, and a ton of them as well too. Again, like, it's not necessarily, some of the stuff in here is going to be keyed to the Pathfinder Pathfinder rule set, but so much of the stuff, like the quirks and things like that, are very easily convertible. There's great rules or suggestions for how to interpret the things like item availability in different communities, and while that is keyed towards Pathfinder, it's cool stuff you can very easily convert over for D&D as well. If you want to have a reason for why your players are, moving from the small town where they've been located to the big city, well, you can't buy big items there. You're limited in what you can spend and what you can purchase. And there's some great advice for how to do that in Pathfinder that's very easily applicable to AD&D as well. So I like that a great deal. This last thing from Pathfinder is it really is just a matter of inspiration. I can't use the rules for that. And it's the Monster Codex. So what the Monster Codex was the last of the 3 codexes they released. They released an NPC Codex, a Villains Codex, and then the Monster Codex. What this is like I mentioned, like, or for those familiar with Pathfinder first, forgive me if I'm just repeating stuff you already know, but Pathfinder works differently than older versions of D&D or more modern, where you add levels and you know, there's a certain set of character creation rules that you use for pretty much everything. And what this does is it creates character versions, NPC versions, of the different monsters that you can then use, and they generally span the range of like when you would first meet the monster up until 20th level, the max in Pathfinder. Now, while the rules themselves are not something you can use, the ideas behind them are easily, because like creating monsters in AD&D or in AS is really, really easy. You know, if you don't want to just reskin an existing monster, it's easy to throw together a monster and eyeball from existing things what it should look like. You usually look at what, you know, you want the rough sort of difficulty to be and then tweak some stuff. Start with an ogre and add some shit on, you know, Bob's your uncle. You got your, you know, heavily armored gnoll like I did. So, you know, for me, in the recent big fight we've had with the gnolls in Night Below, I went to the gnoll section in here and read through every gnoll they've got there. So I've got a gnoll barbarian, I've got a gnoll skirmisher, gnoll war leaders, gnoll devotees, you know, so tons of different things. And what they are is like gnoll with barbarian levels, or gnoll with mage levels, or gnoll with whatever. And then also some magic items and some advice on how to structure encounters with them. And even though I didn't necessarily use most of the stuff that's in here, the stuff that I did use was really, really helpful for coming up with neat ways of making one kind of monster a varied monster. You know, so that every gnoll they fight is not the same damn gnoll. They don't know that every single gnoll has 2 hit dice and a 5 armor class. There's a variety in what they're facing. And this thing I'm going to use for the, you know, in every campaign, because there's always great ideas in here. Even if you reject them or if you tweak them, there's tons of great starting points of like, oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's something that would be, you know, I would be able to use in my game. Let's see, I think that brings us to the end of the actual like AD&D or Pathfinder stuff. Let's talk about some third-party products. And we'll start with my absolute favorite, which is Dungeon Grappling. This was written by a guy named Douglas Cole from Gaming Ballistic. I use this in my AS game, all of my AD&D games, my Pathfinder game. I'm going to use it in Starfinder next time I run it as well. This little sucker, it's a very slim volume. What it does is it gives rules to make grappling and, you know, and the things that are associated with that. Throwing someone to the ground, tossing someone aside, hurting them by wrenching a limb and stuff like that. It gives you a comprehensive set of rules you can use for any of those game systems, not Starfinder, but Pathfinder, OSR games, and 5th edition. Full rules for making grappling its own fun thing. And I adore this product. I feel that it gives... you know, not necessarily, like, not everyone's going to be like, now we're going to wrestle, you know. What it is really good for is creatures that would drag you to the ground, like hyenas or wolves, or that would wrestle you to the ground, like bears or owl bears, or, you know, giants that want to pick someone up and toss them away. Phenomenal rules for doing that stuff. And like the disarm and the... nets that I mentioned out of Combat and Tactics, what the way the target number that you need to hit to grapple somebody is completely independent of their actual armor. So, you know, for those, you know, uninjurable colossus behind a shit ton of magical plate mail armor and a shield that gives a huge bonus, this is a way for those characters to feel peril. You need to use it in moderation like anything else. If you use it all the time against those characters, it invalidates the thing that makes those characters cool, so you got to be cautious. But what it does do is it makes that grappling feel like another dynamic part of the combat system that they need to account for. Fighters still feel like badasses in it, and wizards feel like pusses. Wizards, because of how many, you know, hit points they have and how little they contribute when they're grappling, they go down real fast in it. But it gives it, which is another way of giving a fun, you know, it gives a fun dynamic. You can put mechanics behind the idea of like, shit, they've grabbed the wizard and they're running off with them. You don't need a hand wave or anything like that. You got a fun bit of mechanics you can use for that. So Like I said, I've used it in Pathfinder, in AS&SH, in AD&D Second. I will be using it in 5th edition when I run that next, and I will be using it in Starfinder next time I run it, because it's very easily convertible over to it. If more so than any other game, any other of these side products, this is one of those ones that I use soup to nuts. I use everything out of this stuff because it's so good, and I often find myself rereading it just to refresh my memory for some of the neat things that things can do. It also gives variety to the character, so like it gives you different ways of achieving the same thing. If you want to bull rush someone, there's options out of combat and tactics to like bam, knock someone back. So that's one way of doing that, but you got to hit their armor class. Another way is to grapple them and then convert some of the control points, which is what you generate as you're trying to wrestle them to the ground, to then toss them or push them or slam them to the ground and then get them under control and throw them. Or disarm them, same thing too. You can use a disarm maneuver, or you can try and wrestle them to the ground and then get it out of their hands. And the fun thing with that too is you can make a whole... you can gamify a part of the tactical experience without having the consequence of death in it too. So bar fights become really, really fun and unique, as the characters are alternating between using improvised weapons and punching and grappling and throwing them into, people throwing into different, beer barrels or whatever. It's a really, really great product. I really can't say enough great things about it, especially with how many different things you can use it with. So I love that. I also use... Now, the publisher in this is kind of controversial right now. I had purchased this already from before this came out. But this is Veins of the Earth, published by Lamentations of the Flame Princess. What this product does is it tries to apply real-world caving principles to underdark exploration, so like under the ground exploration. So what would it be like under there, with what kind of monsters would be down there, what kind of exploration would you use? I don't find it's really inventive. It's a very, very creative book. The art is by Scrap Princess, and if you like her art, you're going to love it. If you don't, then you'll really hate it. There's really no two ways about that stuff. But what I use out of this is the rules for navigating. I ended up getting this when, after the first time I went spelunking. I went spelunking for the first time, and the act of going through those caves and crawling and squeezing and then finding big caves and small caves and things like that really affected the way I thought about what an Underdark campaign might be, and fun ways to make, in the same way that I use Wilderness Survival Guide, to make that place feel present. And I wanted the Dungeoneer Survival Guide for AD&D does some of that stuff, but I like the way this does it a little better. And so I particularly enjoyed that. There's also a neat idea of using light as noise in it. I don't know if I'm going to use it. I'll have to reread the rules in it, because we will be heading under the earth in our Night Below campaign. But at the very least, there's some really great ideas in there and some really good information about actual caving in a game context that will help you to add to make that environment feel as vibrant as what any other kind of set piece environment, what being on an ocean is like, what being in a desert is like. It really gives you some really great ideas for supplementing that beyond the kind of like, D&D-ish Underdark stuff you get in any of the other Underdark products, like Drizzt Do'Urden's Guide to the Underdark, or the Underdark book for 3rd, or the Underdark book for 4th, or the Drizzt Do'Urden's Guide to the Drow. All that stuff is very D&D-ish, and what I will end up doing is using a combination of all that stuff. I like having the idea of what the real world stuff is like as a foundation, and then I can add my magical shit on top of that. So that's why I like that product. For third-party stuff as well too, regular viewers will know that I'm a big fan of Greg Gillespie's dungeons, Barrow Maze, Forbidden Caverns of Archaea, and what's it called? Highfall? Is that what it's called? Highfell. These are sprawling mega dungeons that are designed to use with basic D&D or Labyrinth Lord. They are Really, really great old school products. Barrow Maze, I've run, like almost 70 sessions worth of play with that, just the Barrow Maze product. But the reason I grabbed this one is because Barrow Maze is one big sprawling dungeon, so it's very hard to just pick certain bits out of it and use it independent of the actual Barrow Maze itself. Highfell is a little easier to do because there are some discrete dungeons, but there's not as many discrete dungeons as there are in this. And I've already used multiple dungeons out of here, or multiple elements out of here in my various campaigns. I've just plucked out and used in another place. And it's fantastic. Like, if to be honest, I mean, if you're looking for sandbox games, there you would do well with any of these, any of this one or Barrow Maze or the other one. But for ongoing sandbox games, this is the one that I find to be the most useful because there are more discrete dungeons that I can just, like, you know, for instance, there's this thing here. You know, I can just use that as written and plunk it into my game. So it's almost like you've got, and here, you know, there's a smaller one right there, and there's another one right there. These are available print on demand or PDF as well too, and whether you get the print on demand or the PDF version, you get PDF versions of the maps as well too for all these things. So it's very easy to convert the stuff over into the format to use them in a virtual tabletop like I do. So love those books. This one is more keyed towards Ash, but Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea has Lovecraft. Like I mentioned, Lovecraft is a big influence in it, but there's not a huge amount of information about the Lovecraftian monsters beyond the paragraph or two you get for the monsters. So I actually like Chaosium put out this great non-game mechanic book called Sandy Peterson's Field Guide to Lovecraftian Horrors. And what this does is, you know, I just realized I forgot to turn my camera backwards, so every single one of these damn things will be backwards. I'm sorry, folks. When I'm on Roll20, I end up having you have to screw around with it to stream properly, so I have to have it backwards. So my apologies if you're having to read all of these backwards. But the nice thing with this book is it gives some great ideas. It gives the same sort of like the ecology information that you get in the Monsters Compendium books, but for Lovecraftian monsters. So if you want to get ideas for, like, you know, your Shoggoth, that's what you got that there. Plus, you got some incredible art in here as well. I absolutely love the art out of here. Everything looks amazing. Yeah, it's a really, really great product. But also, it's great for getting ideas for how to incorporate a lot of those Lovecraftian monsters, what they'd be scheming to do, and things like that in my game. You know, I've only recently started leaning more into some of the Lovecraftian monsters because the characters are at a level where they can actually, it wouldn't be a bloodbath for me to use them. So we had our first encounter with the great race of Yith recently. And let's see here. Is there a illustration of the great race in here? Or the Yithian? Where are you? Yes, there are. And look at that. Boom. There's the great race of Yith. Some information about what they like to do. And this amazing illustration. And there's often these kind of little side illustrations that show, you know, like how a Dimensional Shambler or a Hound of Tindalos will run, you know. So really cool product. Not as much why I don't use that in my AD&D games, but for my Ash game, it's fantastic. And then I think the last thing I'm going to mention, because I'm looking around, I think we're at the end of the road here, is Low Fantasy Gaming. Now, Low Fantasy Gaming is a product put up by Pickpocket Press. It is a really, really fun game that I don't know why I don't get it. Well, because I'm running nothing but pretty much AD&D right now, I guess, is why I don't get it to the table. But there's some really, really great ideas for things like random encounters, for weather. I used to use it for that. But it has my favorite table for bar brawls in it. So if you want to have like a fun table for adding some random elements for what's going on in a bar brawl, oh gosh, where is it? There's a ton of great random tables in here that you can use in any campaign, but in particular, I really love the what do you call it? Where is it here? Where's my thing? Because some of the results are hilarious, especially if you make the players roll for them. The weather rules are probably my, apart from like I am currently using the ones from the Wilderness or Ultimate Wilderness from Pathfinder, but they have phenomenal, like, I love it that you set the weather is on the outset of your journey, and then you see how it shifts day by day. It's really great, very easy to add, again, like the feel of dynamic weather without having to track, like, you know, a weather pattern or a calendar or whatever. Anyway, I can't find it right now because, of course, I'm looking for it, so I can't find it. But there's a table for, oh, here we are, Tavern Brawls, found it. It's worth saying what's in there. There's some other great stuff that's in here too, but you know, some random results are like a shattered lantern flares in some spilt alcohol, setting part of the tavern on fire. Or a PC is grabbed by 3 brawlers and thrown across the bar, knocking off mugs and plates. Or the PC is knocked out by a lucky haymaker for 2d6 rounds. So in my mind, what it is it's that like frenetic, crazy, you know, pulpy fight that you see in like Raiders of the Lost Ark. Right, where crazy shit's happening. So it's not so much that it's just crazy random stuff. It's stitching those random things together into a fun, dynamic kind of environment. And if you add that with the dungeon grappling rules, it can make for a really, really fun, you know, tavern brawl. Make that. I mean, that may not be a part of your campaign, but if you're playing a more swords and sorcery game, like, you know, Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, or whatever your home version of a sword and sorcery game is, or, you know, if your Greyhawk game leans more in that direction, it's some really fun, a fun way of adding some extra texture. And there is a PDF version of this you can get for free as well. Mine is the print-on-demand version. So I think that's kind of, that's it. So I think that is probably that's a lot of different products that I now have to make sure I write down and add to a list to add below here. But I hope that this gives you some ideas for, you know, different products you can use. And I guess, like, for myself, regular viewers will know this already, but I very much embrace the idea of house ruling. So I love drawing from, for one thing, to justify my stupid purchases of these books, but also because it's always fun to add good ideas where you can find them into your game. And everything that I've referenced here, I've made at least, it's contributed something to the ongoing campaigns that I've been running. You know, be it random spells or neat monsters or ways of interpreting certain parts of the play experience different from what the core rules as written would be it wilderness travel or underground exploration or unarmed combat or tavern brawls or whatever. And it's fun. I mean, I like that. I like having that kind of variety to be able to stitch together precisely the kind of play experience I want. It's also cool to try different things, right? Like I mentioned, I changed my weather, rules from one to another. So just because the game or the book isn't written for the game that you're running, certainly, try stealing an idea from it or two and see how that affects your ongoing game. Especially for a sandbox game, so much of that is about exploration anyway, seeing what the characters do, what random things they encounter. Why not try some new things as well? So let me say a quick, oh my goodness, there's lots of folks in. Howdy everybody. Jeez, good Lord. Cam, Indy, Unimportant Hero. Howdy guys. Howdy folks, I should say. Wayne, what's shaking? Yeah, Celtic Viking. The Celtic and Viking books are cool resources for 2E. Yeah, Indy, I love the Van Richten's guide. I just don't find I use them quite as much as like, things that are based on actual, like I've got other resources I draw on for Viking information, for my Ash game at least. Spellbooks are terrific. I love those spell compendiums so much. Ironfang Invasion, thank you, Indy. I couldn't remember the name of that adventure path. Let's see here. Ultimate Equipment is favorite RPG book. Yeah, I agree. There's so much great stuff in there. You can very easily switch over. Indy uses Dungeon Grappling for PF2 as well, too. Royster, what's shaking, buddy? I haven't seen you in chat in a long time. So that's kind of it. There's some other good suggestions in the chat as well, too, which you will be able to, once this uploads, you're going to be able to you will be free to go through that as well. But I think that brings it to an end. So to circle back to where we started here, the reason I recorded this was because of hitting 3,000 subscribers. So once again, I want to give a massive thank you to everybody who has subscribed to the channel and anyone who has supported the channel in any other way too, by spreading the word, by supporting us on Patreon, by, watching the video, all these stuff is all very, very helpful for us to, so particularly for providing me a way that I can help thank my players, who put up with my DM bullshittery, including my stacks and stacks of books that I draw new bullshit from. So thank you to everybody who has subscribed. This has been, it's been a fantastic year. We look forward to many more years of gaming with you folks. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, if you've got any great products you like using that I missed or that you use for your own game, please do not hesitate to leave a comment in the comment section of the video so other people can learn from, from the things you've been using. Or also so I can steal new ideas, because I always like finding new things to use in my games. In addition, you can reach me on Twitter at Dungeon Musings, and you can find me on email or by email. My email address is dungeonmusings@gmail.com. You can also find me on the Dungeon Musings Discord server, and you can find a link to that in the description of this video. And you can find a link to something called Heroes Save Villages. That is the charity fundraising campaign that we run on the channel. And from now until September 1st, 2020, for every $25 that is donated to Heroes Save Villages, which again benefits SOS Children's Villages International, really amazing organization, you get one chance to win our grand prize or one of our other prizes. The grand prize is... Oh boy. My stacks of books are getting bigger and bigger over here. A copy of this bad boy here, the Eberron Gold Edition Rising from the Last War box set. It's a fantastic box set that has all the contents from the Eberron Rising from the Last War book, as well as a shit ton of other great stuff like maps and handouts and a DM screen and monster cards and, yeah, just fake copies of the Korenberg Chronicle and other papers, so some really great in-universe handouts for it. The good people at Beetle and Grimm donated a copy of this for our grand prize. This is mine. There's a brand new one still in packaging for the grand prize winner. But I've also picked up 2 copies of the Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea core rulebook. So if that big pink thing I started the session with, or the pink book that I started the video with, if that looks cool to you, there's 2 of them that people can win. In addition to a bunch of other, there's the Monsters Know What They're Doing. There's some other stuff from the Dungeon Musings Redbubble store that you could win, T-shirts and posters, and a chainmail dice bag made by one of our players, and some old school OSR zines donated by another one of our players. So some really great stuff, and the best thing is for every $25, all the money, I should say, that's donated, all goes to helping the kids who benefit from SOS Children's Villages International. None of it goes to the channel. None of it goes to any other middleman. So with that, I am going to bring this to an end. So once again, a huge thank you to everyone who's joined us on this crazy journey. That is the Dungeon Musings channel. Thank you so much for your feedback. Thank you so much for interacting with us on the channel, in chat, on the Discord server, by email. I'm still behind on email. I got caught up in all my comments on the videos. So for those who have emailed me, I will get back to you. If you've donated to the campaign and you emailed me, I will get back to you this week and let you know that I did receive your email. So there's, you're not worrying whether it got lost in the ether. I think I've received emails from everybody who has donated to date. So don't, if you did donate and you didn't hear back from me, don't worry. And with that, I'll bring it to an end. I mean, once I get started talking about gaming stuff, I rarely want to stop. But all good things must come to an end, and it is a Sunday night, so I probably should get some sleep before Monday. So for those listening at home, live or otherwise, thank you so much for joining me to talk about some of the stuff I love that I use in my Sandbox games, as is always the case. If this does find you listening during the current crisis, at least the one that's contemporaneous to when this is recorded, I do hope that this finds you healthy, safe, and weathering the current crisis as well as can be expected, psychologically, physically, economically, and until we see you again, happy gaming.